The noise reached him before the sight did, shrill screams tangled with cruel laughter rising from the slave market at Dust Ford. Rowan Hale paused mid-step, every muscle locking as if the desert heat had suddenly frozen solid. In the center of the crowd, 5 Apache women hung upside down from a beam, their ankles bound with fraying rope, their bodies streaked with bleeding welts. The mob treated the display like entertainment, but Rowan's breath died in his chest for a very different reason. On the wrist of the eldest woman was a symbol he had not seen in 5 long years, a Thunderbird carved deep into her skin, the same sacred mark that a Chiricahua woman had burned into his own arm the night she dragged him out of a blazing house and hauled him back from death, a debt he had lived with every day since. His pulse hammered. Fate did not deal coincidences this sharp. "How much?" Rowan asked, his voice low, steady, deadly. The trader eyed him like he was just another greedy spectator. "All 5? You'd have to sell your soul." Rowan opened the pouch he had carried through fire, famine, storms, and solitude. All his savings spilled to the dirt, silver clinking like chains snapping apart. "Is that enough?" he asked. Silence swallowed the square hole. Rowan walked out of Dust Ford at dusk, leading the 5 women away from the town's stench and cruelty. None of them spoke. Their breaths were ragged, their steps uneven, but their eyes, those did not break. The desert wind whipped past them, trying to strip away the memory of what had been done to them, but some wounds lived deeper than wind could reach. By the time Rowan's lonely homestead emerged from the fading light, a wooden house standing stubbornly against the horizon, the sun had bled into the sky like a dying ember. Rowan dismounted first. He didn't touch them, didn't reach for their arms. He only cut the ropes at their wrists and stepped back, letting them stand however their battered bodies would allow. They didn't thank him. Not a single nod. They stood in a silent row, like warriors who had survived something meant to break them. Rowan built a fire, boiled water, laid out cloth for bandages. "This place is safe," he said, voice quiet but firm. "Rest." Then he stepped outside and closed the door. Night swept over the land fast and cold, settling deep enough that even the faintest breath seemed too loud. Rowan sat on the porch, gun resting beside his leg, body carved from vigilance. He waited, listening. Inside the cabin, whispers stirred like fragile wind. Sa, the eldest, spoke with a steadiness that defied the bruises across her face. "That man is no slaver," she murmured. "He saw the Thunderbird." Nahima inhaled sharply, her ribs aching. "Some folks treat that mark like a curse. Why would he step in for us?" Lyria, always the one who braced against the world with sharpened words, answered, "No white man has a reason that ends well." Amita, gentle even in suffering, placed her hand on Lyria's shoulder. "But we breathe tonight. That counts for something." Then the youngest, Kia, whispered through trembling lips, "If we die, who will find our children?" That single sentence cut through the walls. Rowan, sitting on the porch, didn't understand the Apache words, but he knew enough to recognize grief when it cracked open. He heard only the phrase, "Find our children." His fist clenched hard enough to pale the knuckles. The door creaked open. Sa stepped outside, her posture unbroken despite exhaustion that clung to her limbs. Her eyes held storms he could barely comprehend. "You," she said, "why save us?" Rowan didn't flinch. "Because a Chiricahua woman once saved me. When I saw the mark, I knew doing nothing would be the same as betrayal." Nahima stepped out, gaze sharp as flint. "Your debt is paid. We need no keeper." Rowan nodded once. "Then rest. In the morning, go if you choose. I'll ready the horses." No one responded. Inside, they lay by the fire without sleeping. Outside, Rowan remained awake, guarding strangers who, by sunrise, would unknowingly become the beginning of a family he never expected to have. Dawn came without beauty, more a pale smear of light pushing the darkness aside. Rowan stood in the yard with a pot of coffee simmering over a small flame, letting the bitter scent curl into the dry air. The door opened slowly. Sa and Nahima stepped out first, back straight despite the tremor in their limbs. The other 3 followed, forming a line like spear points. They didn't offer thanks, and Rowan didn't expect any. He simply handed each of them a water skin and a piece of hard bread. "Heat'll be worse today," he said, nothing more. Sa's gaze stayed on him longer than before. "We have to leave," she replied. "There's somewhere we must go." Rowan nodded toward the corral. "I've got horses. 5 of you on foot won't last far." Lyria folded her arms over sore ribs. "We didn't ask for gifts." Rowan let out a short, humorless breath. "You're wounded, not helpless. That's different." They rode out together as the sun lifted over the dunes, and it didn't take long for Rowan to realize they weren't heading toward any village. They were driving straight into the kind of territory where slavers, mercenaries, and ghosts like to hide. "You're not going home," Rowan said quietly. Sa halted, sand spilling around her boots. "We have no home," she answered, Nahima's eyes fixed on the horizon. 15 children were taken 3 days ago. Slavers hit our village at dawn, stole the little ones, and dragged us off to sell. If we don't catch them in 7 days, they disappear forever. The words hung in the air, heavy as storm clouds. Rowan did the math in his head. The distance, the heat, the time. "And 5 of you plan to walk 200 miles following ghosts?" he asked. Sa's jaw tightened. 15 children, she repeated. 5 come from our own wombs. In that moment, understanding landed in Rowan's chest like a hammer. That was why they hadn't screamed under the whip, hadn't begged when they were hung like carcasses. Their pain had already been claimed by something greater, the terror of mothers with empty arms. He remembered another fire, another night, another woman dragging him from death's mouth and etching a Thunderbird into his arm so he'd never forget. Maybe this was where that debt pointed all along. "I'm going with you," Rowan said, "until every one of those children is back where they belong." Their surprise was visible but quickly swallowed. They moved south through a desert that felt alive and angry. Amita took the lead on the tracks, fingers brushing the sand, reading signs he barely saw. Wagon ruts still sharp, ash that still smelled of smoke, a horseshoe pressed deeper on one side, hinting at a wounded rider. "They push hard," she muttered. "They don't treat the little ones as children, only as cargo." By midday, they reached a ruined rest site, burned posts, old coals, and a dark stain of dried blood. Lyria knelt and lifted a tiny bone bracelet, her voice cracked. "Mickey's," she whispered. "My daughter." No one tried to comfort her. There was no comfort to give. They pressed on, faster now, the desert swallowing their footprints as quickly as they made them. Hours bled together until the sky dimmed to indigo and coyotes began to howl, their voices twisting across a stretch of land littered with animal bones. They pushed forward anyway, driven by a fear that had outrun exhaustion. Rowan walked at the rear, 2 extra water bags slung over his shoulders, sparing the women that weight. Sweat burned his eyes, but he never once thought of turning back. Near midnight, shapes moved ahead, separating from the rocks, 3 men, rifles and pistols already drawn. "Look at this," their leader sneered. "Runaway red women and a cowboy stray. There's bounty on faces like theirs." Rowan stepped forward without thinking, placing himself between the gun barrels and the women. "No one's collecting on them," he said. "Turn around." The man spat in the dirt. "You going to die for them?" he mocked. Rowan didn't have time to answer. Nahima moved first, fast as a lightning strike. She wrenched his knife free and slashed his throat in one clean motion. The second man reached for his gun, but Sa slammed into him, smashing his skull against the stone until he went limp. The third ran, only to collapse with an arrow from Lyria buried in his thigh, then his chest. In the quiet that followed, Rowan let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "They won't forget this," he said softly. Sa wiped blood from her knuckles, eyes dark with flame. "Neither will we," she answered. "We remember everything they took." They left the bodies for the scavengers and walked on beneath a sky filled with indifferent stars. From that night on, Rowan understood they were no longer just chasing shadows. They were marching into a war. On the third night, they camped beside a narrow canyon where the wind funneled through the rocks with a low, mournful hum. Rowan built the fire while the 5 women arranged blankets in silence. No one wasted breath on small talk. Their fear had changed shape. It was no longer fear of death, or slavers, or the desert itself. It was the fear of time slipping too fast, of tiny footprints fading into the dunes before they could follow them. Rowan watched their faces flicker in the firelight, hard lines softened by exhaustion, eyes that should have held joy now dulled by grief. Something inside him, long buried, began clawing its way upward. He had carried guilt for 5 years like a secret brand beneath the skin, but tonight it pulsed hot, demanding to be spoken. Rowan rose, stepping into the glow of the flames. "Sir," he said quietly, "there's something I must tell all of you." The women froze. Every head lifted, every muscle tensed. The fire reflected in their eyes like a dozen sharpened blades waiting for the truth to cut. Rowan's throat felt tight enough to choke him. "I was there," he said, voice cracking despite his effort to steady it, "the day your village burned." The air turned razor sharp. Lyria surged to her feet, fury blazing. Nahima's fingers curled around her knife. Even quiet Kia trembled, as if bracing for an explosion. Only Sa remained still, though her eyes had become cold as a winter canyon. "Speak," she ordered. Rowan forced himself to meet their gazes. "I rode with a mercenary band when I was young, a fool believing lies about justice and duty. I thought we were hunting raiders, not families." Pain rippled across their faces, and he continued before fear could silence him. "When I realized what we were doing, I turned on them. But by then, elders were dead, homes were burning, children were taken." His voice broke. "I didn't hurt anyone physically, but I stood there while it happened. Doing nothing is its own sin." Nahima's voice dropped to a growl. "Silence is the worst weapon." Rowan nodded, accepting every syllable. "They beat me for refusing, threw me into a burning house to finish the job, and someone, one of your own, dragged me out. She carved the Thunderbird into my arm so I would never forget what I owed." He rolled up his sleeve. Under the wavering firelight, the Thunderbird mark glowed like a living ember etched into his flesh. The women stared. Not one of them breathed. That symbol was sacred. Only Chiricahua hands could carve it, and only for a purpose heavier than blood. Rowan lowered his arm slowly. "I survived when I shouldn't have. That is a debt I can never repay. But I can follow you to the end of this desert and beyond if it means bringing your children home." The silence lasted long enough for the wind to shift directions. Finally, Sa stepped forward. She didn't shout, didn't lift a weapon. Her voice was quiet as drifting ashes, but sharp as a blade pressed to the heart. "You did not die in that fire," she whispered. "So you will live and carry the weight alongside us." Rowan bowed his head, not in shame, but in acceptance. "I am yours to command," he said, "until all 15 are found." Sa held his gaze for a long moment. There was no forgiveness, only decision. "Then from this night on," she said, "we are bound by the same sin and the same purpose." The others relaxed just enough to breathe again. The fire crackled, and the desert night tightened around them, knowing dawn would demand more blood than the day before. The fourth morning rose pale and heavy, its thin gold light doing nothing to ease the tension that had settled over the group. After Rowan's confession, the air between them had changed. No hatred, no forgiveness, just a grim understanding that the road ahead would not wait for healing. Amita found fresh tracks soon after they set out. Deep grooves from heavy wagons, bits of dried blood, scattered cloth fibers caught in the thorns. "They're shifting camp," she murmured, eyes narrowing. "Moving faster than before." Sa didn't respond. She simply walked faster, her injured legs refusing to fail. As they crossed a ridge, the land ahead turned red and jagged, territory where slavers often hid their worst crimes. Clues lay everywhere: a tiny shoe, a doll missing an arm, a scrap of cloth embroidered with Apache patterns. Kia clutched it against her chest, eyes glistening but stubbornly silent. No one dared speak comfort. By late afternoon, the rumble of metal broke the stillness. Rowan motioned for them to crouch. Below, nestled between canyon walls, stood an old army outpost turned slaver camp. Wooden fences, guard towers, and 2 freight wagons parked at the gate. The faint cries of children carried on the wind, like distant ghosts. Lyria's voice shook with fury. "They're in there." Rowan counted the guards, 12, maybe more. A direct charge meant certain death. "We go in," Nahima said, already drawing her blade. Rowan stepped between her and the ridge's edge. "If you fall here, who leads the little ones home?" His words weren't gentle, but they struck deep. Sar studied the camp, her breathing slow and measured. "You have a plan?" she asked. Rowan nodded. "Hit from 3 sides. I draw them to the gate. Lyria and Amita climb the north wall, cut down the guards and open a path. Nahima and Kia slip through the back, find the children. When they panic, they scatter. Slavers fight worst when afraid." "And the spark?" Kaya asked. Rowan pointed to a forgotten barrel of liquor near the canyon wall. "One shot into that, and the whole fort will think they're under siege." Sar hesitated only a heartbeat before nodding. "We move when the sun drops." As twilight bled into the canyon, Rowan took his position, rifle raised. The moment the stars blinked awake, he fired. The barrel exploded with a roar that shook dust from the cliffs. Guards scrambled, shouting orders. Amita and Lyria scaled the wall like mountain cats, dropping 2 men before their feet even hit the planks. Nahima and Kia vanished into the shadows, silent as wind. Rowan fired again and again, each shot a small piece of his past he refused to carry any longer. Chaos erupted, slavers fell, doors burst open. The cries of terrified children grew louder. When the last lock was broken, Nahima emerged from a dark room, her arms wrapped around 2 trembling little ones. Behind her poured 13 more, some crying, some too shocked to make a sound. The mothers didn't scream or collapse or wail. They simply knelt and gathered their children with hands that shook from both relief and devastation. Rowan leaned against the wall, chest heaving, blood trickling down his arm from a grazing shot. They had done it, but the desert had one more cruelty in store. A distant rumble grew steadily louder. Not wagons, not slavers, hooves, hard, fast, disciplined. Rowan's heart dropped. He knew that rhythm. "They're here," he whispered. "Black Spur." The mercenary band he had once ridden with, and the same men who had burned these women's village to the ground. Nahima stiffened, hatred flashing across her face. "The butchers of the Sun Clan." Rowan barely had time to speak before 7 riders thundered into view, rifles slung, armor dusty from years of violence. Cassian Briggs, the man who had thrown Rowan into the fire 5 years earlier, dismounted with a smirk that twisted Rowan's stomach. "Rowan Hale," he drawled. "Didn't expect you to crawl out of the ashes. Hand over the brats and the women. You know what they're worth." The 5 mothers stepped forward as one, weapons ready. There was no fear left in them, only the promise of a reckoning long overdue. Before Rowan could answer, Cassian lifted his rifle and fired, aimed straight at Sar. Rowan reacted on instinct. He lunged, shoving her aside just as the bullet tore into his chest. The force knocked him backward, blood blooming across his shirt like a dark flower. Sar fell to her knees beside him, a raw sound ripping from her throat. Cassian laughed, signaling his men to advance. But the 5 Apache women did not retreat. They moved with a fury sharpened by months of grief, years of loss, and generations of stolen children. Nahima charged first, knife flashing in the faint moonlight. Lyria loosed an arrow that struck one rider clean off his horse. Amita and Kia fought like twin storms, unstoppable despite the trembling in their limbs. Sar stayed beside Rowan, hand pressed to the wound, tears streaking down her dust-stained face. "Do not die," she whispered. "Not now." The Thunderbird mark on her wrist began to glow, faint at first, then fierce, pulsing with an ancient power few alive had ever witnessed. Nahima gasped, recognizing the sacred light. "Mother's gift," she breathed. As the battle raged around them, Sar pressed her glowing palm over Rowan's wound, calling whatever spirits would still listen. The blue light seeped into his skin, as if the desert itself exhaled life back into him. All around them, the Black Spur fell. Not one begged, not one escaped. The 5 women fought like the very land had risen through their bones to defend what was theirs. When the final mercenary's body collapsed into the dust, silence flooded the canyon. Rowan drew a faint, shuddering breath. His eyes opened slowly, meeting Sar's gaze. She let out the softest exhale, a mixture of disbelief and fierce relief. Her hand lingered on his chest, right above the wound that had nearly taken him. He touched her wrist weakly. "You brought me back," he murmured. Sa shook her head. No. The spirits chose to return what the fire tried to steal. Behind them, the rescued children clung to their mothers, some sobbing, some too stunned to speak. The fort, once a prison, now stood quiet as a burial ground. Rowan struggled to sit, supported by Sa and Lyria. "It's done," he whispered. "Your little ones are safe." Sa looked across the canyon at the scattered bodies of the black spur, her expression unreadable. "No," she said softly. "This part is done. But healing, that is a different journey." They gathered their injured, soothed the frightened children, and began the long trip back across the desert, toward Rowan's ranch and whatever future waited for them there. Weeks passed in slow, patient rhythms. Rowan fought fever and weakness, drifting in and out of consciousness, but every time he woke, he saw one of the women tending to him, cool water pressed to his forehead, herbs simmering over fire, the sound of children laughing somewhere outside. By the time he could stand again, the ranch had transformed. The 15 children filled the yard with voices that echoed like rebirth. Sa taught them to read the wind and the stories carried in footprints. Nahima trained the older ones to hold a bow with steadiness. Amita taught healing from desert plants. Lyria crafted toys from wood scraps, and little Kia became the guardian of the very youngest, always hovering, always gentle. Rowan taught them to ride, rope, and mend fences. One evening, beneath a star-thick sky, Rowan stood beside Sa on the ridge overlooking the land. There was no ceremony, no rings, no priest, just shared breath and shared scars. "I don't deserve this," Rowan said quietly. Sa placed her hand over his heart, where the wound had closed. "None of us deserve what happened to us," she replied, "but we deserve what we choose to build." And so they named the place Home of the Morning, a place for the lost to rise again. The first rain in months fell the next morning, soft as a blessing. The children ran through it, shouting with joy. Rowan and Sa watched from the porch, shoulders touching, saying nothing. The desert that had once devoured everything they loved now held something rare within it: peace. And friend, if you've ridden this trail with me this far, lean in a little closer. There are people born to wander into darkness, and others born to stand at its very edge and strike a spark. Rowan Hale, a man once drowning in guilt, and Sa, a warrior who carried the grief of her whole people, they did not stumble into hope. They made it by hand, every wound stitched, every child saved, every dawn faced together. The Home of the Morning became proof that a soul burned by the past can still rise like sunlight over a cold horizon. And as long as someone chooses to keep that light alive, hope does not die. It simply waits for the brave to claim it.